Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining me again. Today we start discussing chapter 3 from Spring Start here with wiring the beans in the context. Of course, the book is this one, you already know it, and we have already discussed in the previous episodes chapter 1 and chapter 2, so in case you've missed them, I do advise you go back, and in case you watch me live, remember you have a live chat there, so you can start discussions and ask questions in the live chat. And of course you always have the comment section, and you can follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter in case you have missed the live event. I'm gonna share my screen already, and I don't want to miss any moment of your time. I'm gonna discuss about the content directly. Remember, we discussed about how to put beans in the Spring context last couple of episodes, and you already know that you have two main ways using annotations. It is either the @bean annotation or using stereotype annotations. And of course we do have a third way that we have stepped over quickly because I said it's not as essential as the other two, which is using the register bean method, so the programmatic approach. But remember, we do focus more on using annotations because that's the way in which you will do this most likely in all the applications that you will be working on, unless of course you are unlucky enough to work on a very old application still using XML, which we will not even cover, which my book doesn't cover. Okay, that's because it's too old. So if you do work on such an application, try to upgrade, try to move, try to do something, use annotations. I know it's difficult, but this is the way, no? As the Mandalorian said, this is the way. Cool. So what is about wiring the beans? So I'm gonna go through the diagrams, and you already know that I like to use plenty of diagrams. I have used plenty of diagrams when writing this book, but I still do think that I haven't maybe haven't used enough. So maybe in the next edition I will even put some more of them. Anyway, shortly, this chapter covers the relationships among multiple beans, dependency injection, which we have discussed. You've heard me in the previous episodes saying multiple times dependency injection and inversion of control. We've discussed about it, but we haven't actually done any dependency injection yet, because the only thing you've learned up to this point in this playlist is to put the beans in the context, while dependency injection is rather more related to getting the references either out of the context, either putting them, and that's actually the injection, putting them as an attribute of a different other bean. So it's basically establishing relationship among the beans. You will see this in the current discussion. And of course, how to access the beans through dependency injection, because up to now you've only verified that the bean has been created in the Spring context using the getBean method from the context. Now I remind you, so this is what we've used, but this is not dependency injection. This is just a way in which you ask for a specific bean from the context. It's a programmatic way to get the bean out of the context. But when we discuss about dependency injection, it is a declarative way of telling the framework that from the context you wanted to push a specific reference of a bean into the attribute of another bean. So that's basically dependency injection. So let me go back, and I'm gonna go straight to some diagrams that explain exactly what we want. So this figure 3.1 tells you on the left side it's what you have already learned. So you know how to add a couple of beans in the Spring context. So imagine we have an instance of a parrot, and you have an instance of an owner, I called it, so the person owning the parrot, and they don't have any relationship. Okay, so they are just two instances in the context. How do you establish a relationship among them? By the way, this is the same parrot. I know the colors differs, but I didn't find like the same parrot with the same colors, so that's why they differ. But normally you can imagine this is the same parrot, no? So you established the relationship between the two beans. In terms of Java, this actually means using the reference, putting the reference of the parrot in an attribute of a memory location, an attribute of the owner, no? So but you do tell the framework how to do that, so it's not something that you directly do. Usually you tell the framework to do that, and that's dependency injection. Okay, and of course now using this is figure 2. This is actually the relationship that you have established. So now the parrot, the person has a parrot. Okay, the first last snippet, it actually tells you that you still need to use the Spring context dependency, which makes a lot of sense. Remember that we've discussed this is the most basic and the most important maybe of all the possible dependencies in the Spring ecosystem, because there is nothing without a context. All the framework, the whole framework relies on this context. That is that collection of instances the framework can manipulate, the framework can act upon. Anything that is not in the context cannot be seen by the framework. So that's why the context is so important. So we will still need the context dependency. And then you have two normal POJOs, two plain old Java objects. Remember last couple of episodes when we discussed about putting a bean in the context. A bean can be created out of any instance, any class. The class doesn't have to have anything special. Any class can create instances which, by putting them in the context, become beans. So there is nothing special about a class that defines beans in the end. It only what only makes an instance of a class a bean is putting it into the application context, also referred to as the Spring context. So these two classes define the owner, person in this case, and the parrot. And what you want is to establish the has a relationship. You normally remember about the has a relationship from when we discussed it at the Java fundamentals. Remember that when we discuss about objects, you have and object-oriented programming, you have two main relationships that you can establish among objects. One is the has a, so the person has a parrot. The second one is a, which means that something extends. So the class relationship, it becomes inheritance. Like for example, I know the employee is a person, okay, something like that. So in case of dependency injection, we always discuss about has a relationships. You create has a relationships through dependency injection by putting the instance, the reference of an instance from the context into the attribute of an instance from the context. Have you heard both of them? From the context. So when we discussed establishing relationships, it's both beans should be in the Spring context. The one that is both sides, let's say it's better, both sides of the has a relationship have to be in the Spring context. Because remember, only what's inside the context can be seen and act upon by the frameworks. So the first step is create the classes, and then in a way or another you make them beans in the context. See, like in the first listing here, hey, listing 1. Oh yeah, it's good, listing 1, because this was a code snippet. Okay, listing 1 here, you see it defines the two beans using the first approach, which we have mainly discussed in episode 2 and which is part of section 2.1 here, no, sorry, 2.2.1 here, okay? Now, very, very, very important to remember is that the two things, creating and adding the beans in the context and establishing relationships among them, they are independent one of another. So for using the things that you will learn now, you can use them in the same way regardless of how the instances became beans. So it doesn't matter if you have used the bean notation, or you have used stereotype annotations, or you have programmatically add those instances as beans in the context. Regardless of on how you added the beans in the context, as long as they became beans, so as long as they are in the context, you can use independently all the practices that we'll discuss now for establishing the relationships. So I will even experiment with you some things here to help you understand easier, and the book does that as well, but it can't like probably mix all the combinations. But my advice is you can do that, allow your time to try all the combinations so you can see, so you observe that what I say is right, that it doesn't matter how you add a bean to the context, all the practices for or the methods for establishing the relationships work the same. It's like you don't care how a bean became a bean. If it became a bean by using the @bean annotation, by using the @component annotation, by using the register bean, or even by using XML files, you don't care. When you establish the relationships, it will always work as long as somehow they became beans in the context. So those two here happen to remind you also, is that they are like a recap. They also remind you how to use the @bean annotation. So you see how easily in a configuration class we define the methods create. So remember, one of the advantages of the @bean method is the @bean annotation. So the @bean way of adding instances to the context is the fact that it allows you full flexibility on creating and configuring the instance, and then whatever you return, Spring makes sure that you will add that instance to the context. So if you have done that, of course, listing 3.2 shows you an example of the main class with something that you again already know from the previous chapter using the getBean. So you can find instances of both person and parrot. It's one for each, so you can simply use the type, so you can get them by type. Remember, we discussed last time that if you would have more than one, you need to specify the name. You cannot simply just get them by type. But in my case, it's not the case because you have only one parrot and one person. So you get the person, you get the parrot. And then you display the name of the person, you display the name of the parrot. The name of the parrot is Coco, the name of the person is Ella. And then you display the parrot owned by the person. Can you guess what will each of the lines 4, 5, and 6 show? Well, you have the answer down below. Person name will be Ella and parrot's name will be Coco, which makes a lot of sense because they are indeed the way we configured the instances that we've added in the context. But then the person's parrot, which is the parrot owned by the person, is null because there is no relationship established among. And that's exactly what we discussed today. How can we establish a relationship between the two? And you will see that we have multiple approaches, multiple ways, multiple possibilities that work. And I would say that they are not, sometimes you cannot even say in many cases that they are better one than the other. So some of them are equally good, even in many situations. So how can we do that? How can we transform this case where the owner doesn't yet have the parrot in the case you've seen above where the owner has the parrot, okay? And here is the first of the possibilities, which is in my experience the most difficult to understand by the majority. And it's a very tricky one, and I will explain you exactly why. The first situation is where you call the method annotated with @bean from where you want to configure the reference. So for this person that lately will become bean in the context, we set the parrot of the parrot returned by the method annotated with @bean, which will ultimately become bean in the context as well. And why is this method tricky and why is this method misunderstood? Is because the majority at the beginning don't understand how it's possible that this parrot method isn't called twice. At the beginning, it's normal if it's the first time when you see that, it's normal to feel something not comfortable, like how is possible that Spring calls the parrot method because it's annotated with @bean and puts the parrot in the context, but at the same time when it calls the person method because it's again the same annotated with @bean, it doesn't call again the method creating another parrot. So how is that this approach doesn't actually create two parrots and it actually really creates only one, which happens also to be the one from the context? Because I promise you that this is exactly what happens. So it works this way. And it works this way because Spring is very smart. Spring knows it's not managing is not childishly managing the creation of the beans with the @bean. What Spring does is it has some logic behind the scenes. So when it calls a method annotated with @bean, it somehow creates aspects over that method in some complicated way that it's not now the moment to discuss it. But what you have to know is that when you call the getParrot again here, it's not directly this method that happens to be called, which you would feel that when you call the parrot method here, it's exactly this one. But the reality is that what the parrot method calls here is something that Spring covers, weaves over with logic, telling something like, if the parrot already has been created, then get that parrot from the context instead of calling again the real method, which is this one. But if that method hasn't been yet called and the parrot hasn't yet been created in the context, then do call the real method and create the parrot, put it in the context, and then set it on the attribute. So this approach, even if it feels like it creates two instances of parrot, Spring is smart enough to know what you want and will only create one parrot and will be exactly that instance that you set on the person. And we can test that as well in the code. So I'm gonna create that person. That has a name and the parrot. I will generate my getters and setters and eventually even create the toString method. Now I'm going to go to the class, and this this class is what we used also in the previous episode. Okay, so I'm just saving some time by reusing it. And you say parrot. We create an instance, we set a name on it, and we return the instance, which, if we don't forget to add the @bin annotation, will also become bin in the context. By the way, let's make sure that we do use only one approach. So I'm gonna delete this stuff that we have used in the previous episode. Okay, and now you see you only have a normal Pojo parrot, a normal Pojo person, and I'm gonna configure it without the component scan because I'm using now the @bin approach. Okay, so person, and we do the following. We set the name, then we set the parrot. By calling directly the method, see, when you control click in IntelliJ, it tells you that is this method, because IntelliJ sees it definitely in the same class. But what happens actually, it's some magic behind the scenes, magic that you don't see, magic that only Spring knows. And this way, as we will test, it makes sure that it doesn't create two parrots, so it will only call this method once. You can try that also by adding a breakpoint on one of the lines of the method, and you will see that it will go there only once. So that's a way to test it as well. No, and then I don't get the parrot, I will get the person. Actually here I want to say person p from the context get bin of type person, and then I'm gonna show the parrot, which should be not null in this case indeed. So let me debug this and see what happens with my breakpoint. Remember that I added a breakpoint here on this method, and normally if everything goes well, if everything goes as it should be, the line, this line 15, will only be touched once, so you will not see it there twice, even if theoretically it's annotated and also called from here. And you can see also, if you look in the stack trace, that's one of the ways I do recommend you to work when you learn stuff like this. Try to go through the details, try to understand the framework, try to take a look. And by the way, it's my troubleshooting Java. Do you know my troubleshooting Java? I should have it here somewhere. So this is another book of mine. I will make a series about this one at some point as well. But one of the things it tells you is how you use troubleshooting techniques to learn new things, like we do here now. Like we now use debug, breakpoint to learn more about how Spring works behind the scenes. And if you take a look here, you will see that this line, it tells you cglib. So if you are already bit experienced with Spring, which you don't have to be, okay, because we will touch it later as well. This cglib is what helps Spring create aspects, which is interceptors over methods, and it's something that we will discuss in this chapter number 6 here, using aspects with Spring. So if you are patient enough, we will get into that as well, okay? And then we will come back, we can come back to our example, and you will understand even better, piece by piece of the puzzle, you put it there. So this basically tells you that the method hasn't been directly called. It's not like when a method calls another method through this. It has been called through an interceptor. And that interceptor is basically what creates the logic, making sure that it only goes through that method once, and all the stuff that Spring does, taking the bean, putting it in the context, and so on and so forth. So I'm gonna click once and I leave it go up to the end, you see that it doesn't go one more time through the same breakpoint. It only once touched the breakpoint, which is exactly what we expected to happen. Moreover, we do see that indeed the parrot is Coco. But maybe you don't trust me, and you don't have to trust me. So let's do the following. Let's actually try to get the parrot as well from the context. And then I want to compare the two, say get parrot, and I want this. Let's see if it works like that. Excellent. So this is the parrot, the reference of the parrot on the person, which we compare with the reference of the parrot taken directly from the context. No, this is the reference from the person from the context, while this is the reference from the context directly. Okay, it doesn't go through the endpoint because I said run instead of debug, but it doesn't matter because what I wanted to prove is this output here given by line 19 in our case, which is true. And just as a recap, remember what happens when you use the equal operator for objects instead of using the equals method. What is the difference? This is a fundamentals, Java fundamentals question that the majority of the Java developers learned from the very beginning. The difference between using equal operator versus equals with object instances. When we use the equal operator, we compare references in the memory. While using the equals, you may implement a business logic equality between two objects, like for example, two parrots are the same if they have the same name, or whatever your rule is, which is depending on the application, of course. And the fact that the equal operator here gives us a true proves that we don't discuss about two different instances. This operation here can only give us true in only one situation, if we are sure that it is about the same reference going to the same object in the context in the memory, which proves indeed that even if we have here called directly the method, which might make you believe that the parrots will be that there will be two parrots created, one here and another one here, again, that doesn't happen. See, because of Spring's magic behind the scenes, that CGlib you've seen, and you'll understand better in chapter 6. Okay, I hope that was good and right understood. I see no messages in the chat, which is usually abnormal for a live, but I just hope it's because I explained the things too good and you don't have questions. Okay, so I really hope that is the only reason. Okay, so we did establish, we did find a way to establish the link between these using the direct call. And let me see if this explains exactly what I have explained earlier. So Spring creates, yeah, exactly. So what I was explaining, you know. So when Spring has this situation, Spring creates the parrot bean, adds it to the context. but then when it calls another bean method and the same method is called, okay, the reality is that it's not the method directly called, but an aspected method, which allows Spring to put a condition on it and say, if this has already been called, don't call it again. Use that instance that has already been created. Okay, so here's the logic. So call the parrot bean method from the person. If the parrot already exists in the context, yes, then use that parrot. No, then call the method, create the parrot, and use the parrot. Okay, so it has this logic behind the scenes, even if you don't see it. Okay, I see some messages. Hi, I see hi. So I know I'm not alone here. I'm happy to see. So, been reading your book lately, chapter 8. The question now would be which of the books. I hope I hope it's about this book, because I have like 4 others, and I do hope that you will try to read those others too. And thank you very much for the compliments. Cool. So that's basically it. So we saw that. Now, again, what other possibility we have? You will see that we can use injection. This is what we have done here is not injection. This is a simple wiring between 2 beans decided by us through the possibility the addBean method allows us, which is full. We have full possibility of configuring everything when we create the instance. Yeah, full flexibility over configuration, so it allows you to do that. But another possibility is, okay, this parrot, it's just an instance that comes through the parameter. So you do something like that. And then what do you think will happen in this case when Spring will call the method person annotated with addBean? Well, Spring will observe it has a parameter. And what does Spring do in such a case when a method with addBean has a parameter? It expects that in the context already exists this instance, which means that if it exists, it will take it from there. If it doesn't exist, we'll try to find a way to create it. Maybe later we'll find the method that creates it, or a class annotated with that component. But if during the initialization of the beans it doesn't find this bean in the context, it will crash with an exception, telling you there is no such bean in the context, so I cannot create the person because I cannot create the parrot which I need for the person. So in this particular case, there will be no change in the output, because the only thing we did is, instead of calling directly this method, which is directly, remember what we discussed. No, it's this directly is not really directly. It's directly as Spring will intercept it. Okay, we say directly because that's how we see it. But now we are aware that behind the scenes it's something else that happens. Now you don't do that. Now you instruct Spring that you want this relationship to be implemented in a different way. You tell Spring, give me a parrot as a parameter from the context. Take it from the context end, and now the term comes, and inject it into the parameter. That's why this is the first example of dependency injection that we learn. Because now what we say is that Spring will inject a reference in the parameter of the method in this case. In the majority of the cases when we discuss about injection, injection happens in the attribute of an instance. But you might have also injection in a parameter, like in this case of a method. This is one example where that happens. So question, is it mandatory for the method parameter name be exactly the same as the method name for creating the parrot bean? No, because having only one parrot in the context, it takes it by type, exactly as we did here in the main method here. Sorry. See, you don't need the name. If we had multiple, then we would have to use another annotation that's called the qualifier. But I will not discuss about it now because I want you to focus on what's important. But particularly for this case, and to answer you the question, no, it doesn't necessarily need to be the same name, because in this case, it's taken by type. And again, I said I won't discuss about qualifier. There is lately the possibilities, I think with Spring 6 point something, that you might rely also on the parameter name, but it's not recommended. Because remember, parameter names might be changed, and if you relied on them for injection, your IDE might not be able to see that when you refactor, and then you might introduce errors. So never rely on attribute names, parameter names, method names, whatever, for anything like that, for any configuration, okay, for any descriptive purpose. There is always an annotation for that. Do use the annotation. In this case, the annotation is called qualifier. We will get into it later, okay? Okay, so I'm not sure if I ran it already, but you will not see any difference. It's the same thing that happens, okay? But a different approach. And the first, as I said, first example of dependency injection. See, result the same. The parrot has been injected into the parameter. Going back, okay, shows you exactly this. And then, of course, because we discussed about dependency injection, I think you have already seen, if you follow the previous episodes, you have already seen this diagram reminding you what inversion of control is. So remember, inversion of control is when the framework controls somehow over your classes, over your methods, over your attributes. In this case, you see how Spring controls this method and gives a parameter to this particular parameter, gives a value to this particular parameter here, injecting a value, controlling somehow the method. The framework controls our code. So we have established an inversion of control. Instead of having our code controlling the execution, now we have a framework controlling our code in a given descriptive way that we have in a descriptive way that we have given. That's why it's called inversion of control. The control has inverted from having our code responsible for the execution to having the framework responsible for the execution, of course, in a way we still describe. How? Through annotations. Yeah, going back to the book. Okay. We discussed about this way of using the @bin. Now the second way is using an annotation called auto-wired, and it's the one that we will see very often, but especially with component and stereotype annotations in general, and you will see immediately why. So in fact, actually, as a disclaimer, oh, sorry for that. In older Spring versions, if you have an application that uses something like, I don't remember, I think it was something under lower than 4.3 or something like that. I might be wrong because it was like maybe 10 years ago, but anyway, an old, quite old version of Spring, you had to use the auto-wired yourself. So Spring didn't go directly into the parameter injection. You had to explicitly mark that parameter with this auto-wired. But today, and for quite some time already, we do not use that because Spring in the later versions knows how to do that without you having to specify this at auto-wired, minimizing this way the code that the developer has to use. So why I told you that, because you might work on older applications, you might happen to see older code and you see this auto-wired here, and maybe you wonder, why didn't I teach you how to that you have to put that auto-wired there, or how did it work for me without auto-wired? So in your case, if you see this auto-wired in front of the parameter here on the method on the @bin method, it's because you are either looking at old code or you are still using an older Spring version in your application. If you are using something like 5 and above, then it's no longer needed to do that. But auto-wired is still used, and we will see now exactly how. I will show you 3 approaches, and I will tell you that later I will tell you that only one of them is recommended, and I will advise you to only use that one. Okay. So wiring is then a way for dependency injection. Now, wiring is what I call when you simply provide yourself the link between 2 bins, because you have it's you who have explicitly set the instance on of the reference of the parrot on the person. I call it wiring. While auto wiring is when you don't do that yourself anymore, you let the framework do that. And that's exactly what happens next, what we start discussing now. So let me go through the book first, and then I will go through the example. Okay, so I said that there are 3 ways, and only one of them is recommended. So you can inject the value, auto-wire it, how you call it, auto-wire it in Spring on the fields directly. You can do that through the constructor, which is what I do recommend you use. And using the setter method, which you rarely or maybe never use in production ready code. So in the majority of the cases, using the auto-wired on constructor is exactly what you need. And this is an example. Remember that we said that the auto-wired now is used with the stereotype annotations because it's not needed anymore when you do wiring. I mean, having the @bin, what we discussed a little bit earlier. So you see the person, you annotate the person with @component, and then point number 1 here, field, is adding the annotation over the field, marking the field, telling Spring that when the instance of this class is created and added in the context, from the context, Spring has to take a parrot instance and put it here in this attribute. Spring does that behind the scenes using Java reflection. And of course, the same things happen if you either don't have a parrot or you have more than one parrot. Then only doing it like that will cause an exception. If you don't have that object, what will happen is it will tell you, hey, there is no such object in the context, so I cannot create the person because I cannot find the parrot. If there is more than one, as we have discussed last episode, you have to explicitly give the name of the object. And again, even here, you do that still with that qualifier annotation that I was talking about earlier and that I promised you that we will discuss it later on, not now. So now the simplest example, the one that we provide here, demonstrates the auto wiring by type, meaning that you must only have a parrot in the context. So let me do the following. Let me delete the person from here. Activate back the component scan, which contains the org example beans, which means Spring will search through all these classes, both these classes. And on the person will find the component. And more than that, on the field will find the auto wired. And by doing this, I will get the exactly same result. Well, not really actually. No, it's the exactly same result because I kept the parrot bean as the method, okay? So it still has the name Coco. So if I run this, I do expect to have exactly same output. Perfect. Same output. I'm going to explain it once I answer your question. So once Spring adds the instance to the context, can this instance still be modified? Unless you have designed the instance as being immutable yourself, then the instance can be changed. I mean, its attributes, they are not, if they are not final, if you haven't made them final, you can change them, yes. So that's exactly actually one of the reasons why we don't prefer using the field annotation, because there is no way in which it allows you to make this final. And in general, as a good practice, what you want is to be able to make the attributes final, so that you don't experience exactly what you have said here. Someone, for example, changing this with another reference, which they can do. At least, look, in this case, it's not a final field. So someone would be able to do that without any problem. So immutability is not something that's given to the beans. You have to do that yourself. Unless you do that, they are just simple object instances acting exactly as you designed them. Remember, a bean is nothing special about a bean. It's not a special object. It's just an instance that you have added in the context, meaning in the bucket of instances that the framework can manipulate. That's the context. So that's even why, if you go over here, you will see that even the IDEs in general, IntelliJ in my case, tells you field injection is not recommended. And there are two main reasons why it's not recommended, actually. One of them is the one that I have just described, meaning the fact that you cannot make this final. And second is because when you write unit and integration tests, it's easier to create objects if you have a way to put them. And yeah, there is a way still to put this through the setter, but not really that comfortable from the beginning. So I think we can still say that the main point would be the lack of immutability here. Very good question. Can we use AutoWire inside non-component or service class? What do you think? What did we discuss? That only instances in the in the context can be seen by Spring. So unless you have added anyhow the instance in the context, it will not be able to be used. So the answer is yes, it can be, but only if you have somehow made it an instance. Now, to be in a non-component or service, it would mean that you have used another way to create that bean. And I will actually demonstrate it. For example, you might have used the @bean, or you might have used, as you've learned last time, the programmatic approach. So it is not important if the class is a service or a component or a controller or any stereotype. Important is that that instance is in the context, regardless of how you created it. So for example, you can delete this here. Oops. Okay. And then you can go back and define the person here. Let's give it a name. Just to eventually be able to identify it if we need. And of course, use the @bean annotation to make this a bean. So, in this particular case, we have used the auto-wired annotation inside a class which is not marked with either component, service, controller, or any stereotype annotation. But it will still work because it doesn't matter. And remember what we have said at the beginning of this episode. It doesn't matter how you create a bean as long as it's a bean. If it's a bean, you can manipulate it. Spring can manipulate it, including auto-wired. Auto-wired is an example of manipulation, which is actually even called dependency injection, no? Because that's what we do. We let Spring inject a value in the attribute. So look, running this will give us the same output. See, the parrot is Coco. It's still true, the equality comparison here. And the reason this works is because person, the person instance, it's a bean in the context. When wouldn't this work? It wouldn't work if this was a normal bean but not a bean in the context. Like if I'm deleting this, you will see that. So if I'm deleting this, normally even the IDE usually tells you that it's not fine, but maybe in this case it's just it's not able to update or it keeps things in the cache. But normally now it should not work because there is no person bean in the context. Okay. So what I want you to remember is that the two things we have discussed, the chapter 2 and chapter 3, they are totally independent of one another. It doesn't matter how you create the beans, you will be able to use any of the techniques that we discuss in chapter 3. See, like even if both beans are defined using the @bean, you are still able to use the auto-wired annotation. They are not dependent one of another. So to avoid making things unclear, to avoid, because I know if you are at the beginning, I try to put these details in the most ordered way I can, but I know there are many and might be cumbersome at the first sight. But what I do advise you is the following. Just remember that the two things, adding in the context and auto wiring, dependency injection, they are two different things. That's why I have actually even put them in two different chapters. If you have learned to define the beans without linking them, you can then link them, establish the relationship to one another without thinking about how they have been defined, as long as they have been defined as beans. That's the point. I could have even used the register bean annotation and register them programmatically, and the auto wire would still work. Because it doesn't matter. Because the only thing that matters is that they are beans in the context. Technical, how to prevent user login concurrent. Yeah, that's not the place to ask the question, sorry. So we discussed a totally different subject here. Auto wire inject through constructor or set method. Yes, as I said at the beginning, we have the three ways, okay? So what we discussed up to now, and unfortunately I don't have more time, so we will have to end it here. But up to this point, we have discussed about the first bullet here, which is injecting through the field. And remember, I have also stated that this is not a favorite way. So preferably don't use this approach. In the next episode, I will teach you how to use the second and the third approaches here. And I will tell you that most often in the real world scenarios, you will use the dependency through the constructor. Okay, but to allow the time, let's take this in the next episode. Why are they called beans? Like, I think the term actually was borrowed, if that's why you asked me, why beans and not candies, no? So I guess that's the question. Why beans and not candies? I think the first framework who introduced the terminology of beans was Java EE or specification, whatever. And the beans come from the coffee beans, because Java had the coffee, the coffee logo, no, the coffee cup logo, and everything was around the coffee. Java itself is an island, where a lot of coffee is produced, and so on and so forth. So beans, I think, comes from the coffee beans, but it's not invented by Spring, but it's borrowed from early ages. The first introducing the term of beans being Java EE. What if a prototype bean is auto-wired in a singleton bean? We will discuss this in chapter 5, bean scopes and life cycle. So here we will discuss about singleton and prototype. Up to that point, I will cover the earliest things that you should know. So bear a little bit with me, and I promise at some point I will get into that detail as well. Okay, super. Thank you very much. So I see these are the questions. I'm happy that you were again so many with me here, and time is over. But I can say that we made a good discussion, and I see that many of you were online here. You started chatting. Please do continue. I'm waiting for you on LinkedIn and Twitter. And of course, if you want, you can use also the comment section on the video. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. And until that point, I'm waving goodbye and telling you have an excellent time for study further. Cheers.